Hey, what's up guys? It's been a very long time since my very last video in 2020, I think about March or April. In fact, well, it's been a very busy year. First, I had a new job, and then as you can see behind me, I was spending the entire year basically trying to fiddle with my new house, getting renovations done, sourcing for furniture, everything, and then pretty much moving my stuff and getting settled in. After pretty much taking the entirety of 2020 as a break year, I guess I am now actually free to start making videos again. One of my viewers from Canada, he had contacted me about maybe November or around December of last year to ask a few questions about getting a license, or rather riding motorcycles in Singapore, because he wanted to move to Singapore from Canada. And as you know, Singapore, despite the fact that we have a very efficient civil service, a lot of things regarding the rules and regulations aren't always put down on paper very clearly, and it makes things very difficult for foreigners or people not in the know to understand how things are done here, unless you are a local and you have gone through the entire thing. So now the first and most obvious question that he posed was about the COE, the Certificate of Entitlement, that is very unique to Singapore. I know there are other systems in other countries like New York, where you have the taxi medallion system that is somewhat very similar to what we have here, but it's not quite the exact same. One of the first questions is, I know the COE is for 10 years, and if you buy a new motorcycle, the motorcycle dealerships would get the COE for you, but can you also bid for the COE yourself? Now, technically, you can in Singapore. Anybody can bid for their own COE themselves alongside the dealerships. But for all intents and purposes, it's basically impractical. The thing is that dealerships have more capital to outbid all private bidders en masse for multiple stock of COE, and they have decades of experience in figuring out the optimum amount to bid, so low enough to marginally outbid the majority of private bidders and a lot of smaller dealerships. So usually what you would see is that if you try to bid yourself, you would bid a lot lower than what this dealerships can do, and a lot of these dealerships, they can have the capital to actually back their bid, and once they outbid literally all the smaller dealerships and private bidders, they would then eventually resell it out or subcontract those COEs to these smaller dealerships, because once you bid for it, there's a small window before you register the motorcycle or the car, where you can transfer these COEs. So it's one of the problems with the COE system right now, which is for another story. The next question that my viewer posed is, if I buy a new motorcycle from the dealer, the COE is valid for 10 years, what happens after 10 years? Pretty simple. There is really only three options that you have once your COE runs out. You either have to scrap the machine, send it to scrapyard, deregister it, and it's gone forever. The other option is, if you would like to keep the bike a bit longer but you aren't exactly committed to putting down the full price of the prevailing quota. So after 10 years, when your COE runs out, you have to just pay the prevailing rate that is currently for that half of the month, which I'll talk about later. You can renew it for 5 years, which extends your COE for 5 years for that particular motorcycle or car, except that once that 5 years are up, you can't renew this COE. The vehicle has to be deregistered and scrapped. So this particular COE form of renewal is kind of unpopular and only the last resort if you have absolutely no money to renew your COE and you absolutely still need to continue using the vehicle. Otherwise, it generally pays a lot more to just offload the bike with maybe 5-6 months, take a larger hit to the value of the bike, maybe sell it for literally half the price that it would get on the open market, and then recoup that loss, rather than doing that route, because not only would that bike have absolutely no value once you do it, but then you are paying for essentially just life support, and it's kind of not worth it in the long run. Just offload it to somebody that is willing to buy it at a discount rate, and then he will probably just renew the COE for 10 years, because that's how you keep the value of the bike. And of course, the last route would be to just renew the COE for 10 years at the prevailing market price of the COE of the class you're looking at, motorcycles in this case. The next question is the COE tied to the owner of the vehicle? The answer is the COE is not tied to the owner. The COE is tied to the vehicle itself. So if you sell the COE to another person and has, say, 8 years left on it, the next person that takes over the bike will have a bike with 8 years worth of COE left on it. It doesn't stay with you. It travels with the vehicle. What documents would you need to bring to buy a used motorcycle in Singapore? And in this case, it doesn't really matter if you are local or a foreigner. The process is the same as buying a new motorcycle. You just need to make sure you have a Singaporean motorcycle license of the appropriate class, 2B for anything under 201cc, 2A for anything under 401cc, and class 2 for any bike that you want. The next document that you will need is a valid identity card to issue to you when you took up residence in Singapore. If you're Singaporean, you are using your IC or identity card. If you are a permanent resident, you have your own identification. And then if you are a foreigner working in Singapore, you have your relevant permits, and then optionally you might want to sign up for SingPass, which will make things a lot easier for both you and the seller, and I'll talk about that after this. And then of course you will need, before you can even take possession of the motorcycle, a valid motorcycle insurance with a period covering the date you wish to take possession of the bike. So what things do you need to make sure you get from the previous owner before you buy is make sure he gives you the registration number of the bike, the chassis number, the VIN number, and the engine number. There should be a number related to the chassis. Most people that already own a motorcycle, they should know how to get that information for you. So just make sure they give this 3 pieces of information to you, alongside, of course, you knowing what kind of bike it is, what model and make, and what cc. Ask them to give you a screenshot of these details with which you can buy the insurance. And of course, if you and your seller both have SingPass, you can of course choose to make the transfer of ownership digital. So you just need to log into SingPass, follow the instructions on the One Motoring website on how to transfer ownership. Otherwise, just meet up with your seller at the LTA headquarter office at Sin Ming Lane in Singapore, and then do it in person in front of an officer. Now, the next question is, if I want to buy a bike that is over 10 years old, are there any extra steps, or is the process the same as buying any other used motorcycle? Simply put, the steps are the exact same as any used motorcycle. If it's older than 10 years old, it means that the current owner has already renewed the COE once for you. Just make sure that the COE applied to this vehicle is a 10-year COE renewal and not the 5-year non-renewable certificate, because unless you are specifically looking for a bike that only has 5 years left, that has a 5-year renewal period applied to it, make sure it has a 10-year, because if it has a 5-year, there's nothing wrong with buying a bike with only a 5-year renewal on, because it still works. It's just a point where you can use to knock down the price a lot, because the value of the bike would be the prevailing value of the COE when it was renewed, divided by half, and that is the value. The machine itself has no value because it is intended for the scrap heap either way. So I wouldn't, if the COE when it was renewed was say 8,000, I think quite a few years ago it was that way, and then divided by half, that would be 4,000, and that would be what the guy paid to renew the bike for 5 years. So if he had used it for say 2.5 years, then I think the best value for that machine would only be 2,000 plus, on maybe a couple $100 on top of it, depending on how much you're ready to argue about the price over, because 5-year bikes have absolutely no value itself in its own right when you can't keep it running longer than that, even though it's perfectly serviceable. The other one that you need to take note of is you have to acknowledge that road tax premiums for bikes older than 10 years will definitely be higher. So the way things work in Singapore is that if, let's say, my ZX-6R, my 05 ZX-6R, between the years of 2005 and 2015, the road tax would have costed me maybe about $100 per year. After 2015, it will incrementally increase at a rate of 20% over the original road tax price. So the first year, after the 10th year, you'd be paying $120. Then the second year, you'll be paying $140, all the way until the 5th year, where the price of your yearly road tax will max out at 100% over the first cycle COE's road tax price. So $200 for me in my case, and then you'd be paying $200 every year from then on. Next questions related to bike prices. I have seen listings on Carousel for used bikes, and the price for the same motorcycle model and year vary wildly. One trend I have seen is that the cheaper ones have COE expiring soon. In Singapore, as a rule of thumb, most bikes are valued on a straight line depreciation model with no salvage value at the end of 10 years. Because it is always assumed in Singapore that vehicles after the end of 10 years, they will end up being scrapped. So there is absolutely no value for motorcycles where there is no scrap value. For cars, there is a bit of a rebate when you scrap it after your first cycle. But motorcycles, no. You don't get any rebates for recycling your motorcycle after its first cycle. So bikes are at the bare minimum worth the cost of the bike from the dealership plus the prevailing COE value, and divided by 10 years times the years of COE left. The rest beyond that basic value that the bike is worth is generally marked up based on the perceived supply and demand, just like the rest of the world. So the reason why there is such a huge variance in prices really depends on, number one, the perceived level of value that the sellers have on their machines, and it doesn't really reflect the true value of the bike, because on this private e-commerce platforms where you actually go down and talk to the owner and discuss prices, it's all down to how well you are going to talk the price down with the owner and then reach a sort of an equilibrium in what you both consider as worth paying for on a particular machine. The prices are not set in stone. It's all very, very, very personal, unlike in many places in the US where they have services like the Blue Book, where they will value the vehicles professionally and everybody kind of follows the standard format and maybe plus minus a couple of hundred from there. But in general, a lot of weight is given to bikes that are stock in Singapore with a lot of years left on its COE, and of course with a bike in its first cycle of its COE. That's where the value goes up, and then if any of these particular three items are missing from the bike, the value tends to drop quite sharply off from there. The next question is high mileage. Why do used bikes in Singapore have such high mileage? Here in Canada, anything above 30,000 kilometers is considered high for a super sport, and mileage over 70,000 is unheard of for a super sport. Whereas, of course, if you have seen on Carousel or basically gone to any buddy's bike that you know of and you look at the odometer, 100,000 kilometers is freaking common in most bikes here. Now, the difference in why mileage is viewed so differently, where in Singapore, if I'm looking at a super sport that has 70,000 kilometers on the odo, oh, that's actually low. Whereas in Canada, people wouldn't take the bike if there has been more than, let's say, 20,000 kilometers on it, for example, is because motorcycles in the West are generally regarded as toys, whereas in Singapore, motorcycles are a tool first and foremost, even if it's a super sport. For example, I mean, I am a prime example. I have a super sport and I don't take it to a track. In fact, I take it on the highways, I take it to work daily, so back and forth, and it sees most of its time on the highway and not on a track. So most people here use their motorcycles regardless of the model, regardless of the type, regardless of what it was originally designed to do, as a way to get to work, get around the city, run errands, instead of just purely the joyride aspect of it. Alongside that fact, a lot of Singaporeans also take their bikes up to Malaysia and even Thailand, where you can actually clock up serious miles. Basically, adding 6,000 kilometers to the odometer every single year is considered very light. I generally don't tour in foreign countries on my own motorcycle. I prefer to fly and then rent a bike locally over there and use other people's motorcycles because I like to change things up a bit. But I don't do delivery jobs, and I mostly use my bike to get from home to the office and back. So I am a very light user of my own bikes, and I can clock 6,000 kilometers every single year easily. Can you imagine what kind of mileage delivery rider or even somebody that travels to Malaysia or Thailand frequently can clock on their motorcycles? They can easily do 12,000 kilometers every single year. It's not even hard to do so. So for someone who like me, who does 5 days a week and does 30-40 kilometers a day, that's just the norm. And to be honest, a lot of people look at the odometer readings and then compare it to Singapore's size and think, how is it possible that somebody like me, who only stays in Singapore, is able to clock 6,000 kilometers a year in such a small country? But the truth is that Singapore isn't actually very small. If you think about it, it's about the size of New York City proper by land size, and if you include the border crossings to Malaysia, where most people that live in Singapore have both business and family on both ends of the border, well, it's not surprising. We actually have a lot of ground to cover in both Singapore and Malaysia alone. Next question, license conversion. I understand that Class 2 is the unrestricted motorcycle license that I will need to ride a super sport bike in Singapore. I have an unrestricted motorcycle license here in Canada, and I can ride motorcycles of any engine size and power. I wonder whether you know the answer to the questions below, blah blah blah. Most information I found online is regarding car license conversion and not motorcycles. So he's asking, when I move to Singapore, can I get a Class 2 motorcycle license directly, or would I be forced to get a Class 2A or 2B first? Because as you know, in Singapore we have a tiered licensing system. For anybody that is born in Singapore or first got a license in Singapore, you had to first get your 2B license, then wait 1 year, and then get a 2A, and then after that you get your Class 2. So it takes 3 years to even be allowed to ride anything above 400cc in Singapore. And I shit you not, the tests in Singapore are the hardest in the world. The question is, can you get a Class 2 license in Singapore as a foreigner if you already have a license elsewhere? And the thing is, you can, but with caveats. It depends. So you will need the following documents in order to be able to have a significant chance of converting directly to a Class 2 license, and that is documentary proof of training and testing with a motorcycle of the appropriate engine capacity. So if you took your license in, let's say, Canada, you just need to make sure that whatever certificate they give you to prove that you have passed the courses or to get your license does state that you took the test with a bike 400cc and above, and that you are certified to ride a motorcycle of this engine capacity. Next thing is, you need documentary proof of ownership of a motorcycle of the appropriate engine capacity, and they never do specify how long you would need to own it. But in general, I would say the rule of thumb is, if you can at least own the bikes for 3 years or more, or show continued ownership of several heavyweight bikes 400cc and above for 3 years or more, it does help significantly, because that in general is what the time frame it would take for a under local licensing systems would take to own a Class 2 motorcycle in Singapore themselves. Of course, the last thing is at least 1 year of motorcycle riding experience anywhere in the world. Generally, it would be the earliest date you can prove you are allowed to ride motorcycles, which is namely the date you got your license. So the last point is pretty moot. It just comes naturally eventually. So these two documents are the most important thing that you would need to bring. And the next one is optionally, if you come from a country that is not English speaking or has official documents not in English, you might want to have a international driving permit or an official English translation of your license from your country's embassy in Singapore, or a license translation firm registered in Singapore. Now the thing is, there is no strict points system when it comes to such a conversion. Okay, if it's really up to the officer's discretion. So documentation has to be quite thorough enough to make a strong case, as it can still be rejected and they would only convert you to 2B licenses, after which you would need to go through the same path as everybody else. So some of you might think it's a bit unfair because you come from countries where there is a very strict point system criteria where conversions happen, but in Singapore everything happens based on discretion, just like our immigration policy in general. The last question that he asked is, other than the knowledge test, would I also need to do a road test to get a Singapore motorcycle license? Now, the answer is, when converting, only the knowledge test is required. It's called the basic theory test, or the BTT, and it has to be taken at one of the 3 recognized test centers, which is in Bukit Batok Driving Center, the Comfort Delgro Driving Center, which is in Ubi, and then there is the Singapore Safety Driving Center. Only these 3 places are allowed to conduct tests for and basically convert licenses in general. And that's all you really need. You don't need to take a physical driving test. You just need to get all your paperwork in order, go there, have it converted, boom, done. And that's all for now. I think this video is going very long and I'd like to cut it short here. I'll be back with a bit more answers to these questions, as my friend here has asked quite a lot of in-depth questions that I think a lot of you out there might hear. And I'll see you in the next video. Hope you liked it, and share this with your friends if you think they might be interested in getting a motorcycle or moving to Singapore and getting a license in Singapore themselves. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.